Good day, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you might be located. I'm so glad that you're with me. 3 lives in 3 days. And maybe, just maybe, the best is yet to come. So here's the thing. If you are with us for the first time, I'm so glad that you're here. If you're here not knowing exactly what you signed up for, I'm about to tell you. What I'd love for you to do is to go into the comments of whatever platform you happen to be on and say hello and tell us where you're located. That would be wonderful. So I have a sense of who's here. But this eventually will be an episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. You see that little logo up in the top corner. You get the chance to be a part that comes out, and you get the chance to have a hand in what the show or what the conversation will actually be about. The way to do that is to imagine that you're joining Phil and I, who I will introduce in a second, for a cup of coffee or a glass of water or whatever. And so if we were all together around a table, if you had a question, you'd ask. If you had a comment, you'd share it. If you had an idea, you'd share that as well. And so I hope you'll do all of those things. Use the comments to ask your question, share your comments. If you do that, we'll have a better conversation, a more interesting and useful conversation, and eventually, therefore, a better podcast episode. So back to the idea of the podcast. All of the stuff I've just shared with you won't be on the podcast. It wouldn't make any sense. So what I'm going to do is a countdown where we will trim the audio and video to start the actual podcast. And so, Marissa, that's for you. In 3, 2, 1. Let's talk about the future. After all, is where you will be living. And as a leader, we must keep our eyes looking to the future. It's part of our job. Today, we're talking about the future and some forces that exist that will have a significant impact on what that will look like. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. And if you're listening to this podcast, you could have joined us live. Well, you can't go back and listen to this one live, but you could listen to future episodes live. And to find out when they are and interact with us in that way, you can join our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to learn more about when lives are taking place so you can join us and get the information sooner. Today's episode is brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Team, Designing a Team for Everyone's Success. You can learn more about that and get an excerpt at longdistanceteambook.com. That's longdistanceteambook.com. And with that out of the way, let me bring in our guest. His name is Phil Simon. Let me introduce him officially, and then we'll get started. Phil is a sought-after speaker and recognized authority on technology, collaboration, and the future of work. He advises companies on how to use technology. He is the author of several previous books, including Reimagining Collaboration, Message Not Received, and The Age of the Platform. He's also the author of 2 Dummies books, Zoom for Dummies and Slack for Dummies. But today we're talking about his newest book, 9, The Tectonic Forces That Are Reshaping the Workplace. Phil's contributions have appeared in the Harvard Business Review, CNN, Inc. magazine, the New York Times, and many, many more. He has degrees from Carnegie Mellon and Cornell. And today he is our guest. Phil, welcome. So glad that you're here.
Hey, Kevin, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our chat.
It is my pleasure. So you have an eclectic sort of past. You've done a variety of different kind of things, some of which I knew about, some of which you and I chatted about before we went live. So I guess where we'll start here is what led you to this work?
Oh, gosh, I guess that I've spent my entire career, Kevin, at the intersection of business, data, technology, and people. I used to work in corporate HR after I got out of grad school. I realized that was not a good fit for me. My manager doesn't like me. Why didn't I get the promotion? I was much more interested in data and technology. So I took a hybrid job implementing HR and payroll systems down in Latin America, eventually got rid of the hybrid part and was exclusively a consultant, spent 10 years helping companies implement enterprise resource planning systems. And in 2008, something was just growing inside of me. And it wound up being my first book. Decided that I liked writing. I had something to say. I didn't totally suck at it. And have basically banged out a book a year ever since then. So that's my peripatetic background to use a 50-cent word that I usually screw up before 9 a.m.
Hey, success on that one. So the 9 is the newest book, and but before we get to the book, since the book, as I sort of teased in the open, is about the future, I want to start here. Like, when you look into the future, how do you feel about the future? Like, are you hopeful? Are you concerned? Maybe you're some of both. Like, how do
All
you
of it.
feel about the future?
Yeah, all of it. It's very difficult to predict what will happen. I think it was the physicist Niels Bohr who said, no, Yogi Berra, I'm sorry. Predictions are difficult, especially about the future, which is one of those great yogiisms. You have to kind of think about it for a minute if it doesn't confuse you. But yeah, I mean, we could talk about any one of the forces like artificial intelligence, but yeah, there's tremendous promise, and the promise for some real peril as well when it comes to things like deep fakes and massive job losses and all that. But there's certainly opportunity. And the way I look at it in the book, I tried to, I'm a bit of a tech fanboy, but it would be irresponsible of me to say, oh, just implement all these technologies and food will taste better, the air will be cleaner. There are significant downsides to all of these things. And I like to think that I did a fair job in the book of explaining not only some of their specific positives and negatives, but also looking at it in terms of a gestalt. And if you want to ignore all these forces, you can, but I'm not betting on your company being around in 5 years.
So this, by the way, is probably the first time ever that Niels Bohr and Yogi Berra were in the same sentence. So there's your second check mark of the day, Phil. And
I like a good quote.
as do I. You have one in the book, and it's a single word. Plastics
Yeah.
is actually one of the quotes that you use at one of the start of one of the chapters. So, without any further ado, we're going to talk about some of these forces. But why don't you just sort of very quickly lay out with maybe a couple sentences about each, about these 9 forces that you see as things that we need to be aware of and know about and reckon with moving forward.
Yeah, I will cram the entire book into 2 minutes.
No, and that's not really my goal, but just give people
Yeah.
give people the outline of where we'll go for the rest of our time.
Yeah, the first force is employee empowerment. I think that it's foolish to expect people to return to the docile states they were pre-pandemic. The second is dispersion, remote and hybrid work. I don't have to tell you about the importance of that. The third force is inflation. I just don't see it reverting to 2% anytime soon. The next force is automation, which is kind of a cousin of artificial intelligence and generative AI tools like ChatGPT. The next force is blockchain, because people can represent their work as someone else's very easily. It becomes, I think, incredibly important to determine the provenance of certain videos or work or code or whatever. The next force is immersive technologies. To quote the immortal Keith Olbermann about American soccer, it's the future and it always will be. I think you could say the same for decades about AR and VR and MR and all this other stuff, metaverse as well. But it does seem like whether it was Accenture or Walmart, there are companies that are already using this stuff right now. The next force is unhealthy analytics. In the book, I draw a parallel between what will happen in work and what has happened in baseball up until recently. We rely so much on analytics that we made the sport unwatchable for many people. That's why they changed the rules. And then finally, and this was the force I was kind of on the fence about, but I'm glad that I did it, fractions. And no longer will the notion of an office or a job be binary. We're seeing the rise of fractional real estate startups that facilitate time sharing or space sharing arrangements. We're seeing the rise of fractional CXOs. So those are the forces in a nutshell. And to me, Kevin, the most fascinating part of doing the research and writing the book was that they were all interjoined, right? So how would artificial intelligence affect employee empowerment? That's a conversation. How will inflation affect our decisions? How will dispersion of the workforce affect our workers, our managers' desires to bring everyone back to the workplace, knowing that they can save a lot of money on rent? So all of these things I try to keep this at a reasonable length, but there's just so much more to cover up on these topics. I think that they're absolutely fascinating.
And there's another thing that's not one of the 9 forces that is impacted by and is connected to all of the others in my mind, which is productivity, which maybe we'll talk a little bit about as well. So actually, I want to start where you ended with fractions.
Okay.
So let me back up and say, Phil, I'm confident, having read most of the book, that you and I could have a very long conversation, much longer than we will have in this format. And who knows, maybe we will have that conversation someday. But as those of you who are listening or watching, I really want you to be thinking about these things in terms of, what do they mean to me as an individual? What do they mean to me as a leader? How do they impact our organization? And of course, if you are with us live, if you've got a question that comes up as we go through this, feel free to ask it. But I think that you could listen to this on a level of, oh, that's interesting. But I really hope that you listen to it on the level of, what does this mean to me and our business? And that's the frame that I hope that you use as Phil and I have this chat. So let's start with fractions. So many things are fractional now. And so say a little more about that, but then also, what is that going to mean to us organizationally?
It's fascinating to me, Kevin. There are people who are pooling their resources to buy baseball cards and art. And even there's a startup in California called Picasso. It's kind of like time sharing on steroids.
Yep.
So there are, thanks to digital currencies and particularly blockchain, there are ways to prove that you own something. So why should that just be restricted to physical objects? Could you have 3/5 of a job? And it turns out you can. And to be fair, temps and part-time labor have been around for a long time. But I think we're seeing that now ascend to higher levels within the organization. I'm connected with a few chief operational or chief marketing officers, but on a fractional basis. Now, if you're Google or Amazon or Apple, right, the idea of a fractional CFO or COO makes zero sense, right? You're multi-billion dollar company, or in some cases, $1 trillion company. But if you're a 200 or 300 person company and you're growing, but you can't afford to lay down 4 bills for a full-time chief marketing officer, do you want to lock that person in for 3 days a week, give that person a company email address and the air of authority in the organization? I think it makes a lot of sense. If we're expecting employees to come to the office 3 days a week, do we really need an entire building or an entire floor? What could we do with that savings? Could we work out some sort of creative arrangements like some startups are doing, in which case it's almost like sharing custody of a child. So you get this office this week, or Monday through Wednesday, we get it Thursday and Friday. I mean, there are just so many interesting opportunities that wouldn't have been possible 15 or 20 years ago, whether that's the shifts that have taken place, whether that's the development of immersive technologies or collaborative technologies like Zoom and Slack. So, I mean, these are very real things that are happening now. And I'm proud of the fact that the book, there isn't this massive flow chart. If you're a 200 person company in healthcare, you need to do these 6 things. If you're a financial organization with more than 10,000 people operating in Timbuktu, you need to do these 8 things. It really is a conceptual book. Hopefully at the end, I'm giving people things to think about, but right on the back of the book, it reads, "This is not a tactical book."
It's right there. This is not a tactical book. If you happen
No.
to be watching, you can see that I'm holding up. We were talking with Phil Simon, the author of the new book, The Nine, the tectonic forces reshaping the workplace. So I think the fractional one makes a lot of sense, and I think that one probably maybe doesn't surprise people so much. But there are others that I think people maybe don't understand what the implication might be. But before we go there, and I am going to kind of work backwards in the book, as it turns out. But before we go there, I'm curious about this. You and I had a conversation before we went live about how quickly you were able to bring this to the market, and talk about things that are very topical and not wait for another 6 or 8 months for the book to come out. My question is this: how different is the book than it would have been pre-pandemic? Or so
Oh,
there's
very.
the pandemic part and there's the 3 years part. So how has the pandemic impacted these forces, but also what has 3 years changed in relationship to these forces?
So I'm hardly the first person to say, Kevin, that the pandemic accelerated trends that were already in place. For example, it's not like no one ever worked remotely in 2018. One of my favorite data points is that in March of 2018, I think that 18% of commerce took place online. Well, with the pandemic and lockdowns, that ballooned to 28. And that brings up one of my favorite quotes. Vladimir Lenin said sometimes, and I always screw this up in order, sometimes decades happen in weeks, sometimes weeks happen in decades. This was a matter of decades happening in weeks. So a lot of these trends, streaming, Netflix during the pandemic crossed, I think, 1 billion hours a day in streaming. Clearly, people streamed for the pandemic. So the pandemic intensified a lot of these trends. Inflation existed, but with some of the supply chain issues, inflation became worse. In terms of what we can learn 3 weeks after, I think that a lot of these habits have become ossified. To me, it's absurd if a CEO, like whether it's Jamie Dimon at Chase or Elon Musk at Twitter, says everyone needs to be in the office Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, like it never happened. I mean, we're seeing workers quit. There are a couple examples in the book, one in the state of Virginia, one in India, of companies that saw massive employee exits because they said, yeah, we're not doing that. So prior to the pandemic, our work lives were the center and our personal lives revolved around it. Well, if the pandemic had been 2 days or 2 weeks, it's a snow day, right? Back to work. Well, we've proven by all accounts, all the studies have effectively confirmed this, that workers were as, if not more productive working from home. Now, to me, it's absurd if you say I'm never going into an office, the same way it's equally absurd if someone says you always have to be in the office. So I think we'll land, and there's a lot of data on this that I cite in the book, at 2 to 3 days per, give or take. It's going to depend on certain positions. Yep. But as I conclude with the book at the end in chapter 10, pretend that the pandemic didn't happen or actively try to reverse it if you like. I just don't think that you're going to be successful. What do you think?
Well, to try to bungee cord back to where we were, there's all sorts of reasons why it doesn't make sense. That, not the least of which is we spent 3 years doing something new. Why wouldn't we say, what did we learn in those 3 years and then apply it? Like, even if you take all the rest of it away, like if you just said, why would we throw out 3 years of learning and just imagine it didn't happen?
I'll tell you exactly why. It's a trust issue.
Well, there's a trust issue. There's a bunch of issues, and we could go into that deeper. But my point is, I'm taking it out of a pandemic and just saying 3 years. We learned stuff for 3 years. Why would we just ignore that? And that no one would say that makes sense. Now, when you put it back in a pandemic, then people say, well, wait a minute, well, I need you to be back. Or I'll even take the positive intent side of this in terms of some executives, which said, listen, I want my team to be successful. And listen, I became successful being in the office. I know how that works. There's a lot of negativity about folks like a Jamie Dimon or whoever's saying we're going to bring everybody back and they're just dumb, right? You didn't say they're dumb, but like people are saying that. And I would say, I think there are other possible motivations, or at least that are part of it. But the reality is, regardless of the motivations, the future is far more flexible than it's ever been before. And that's the phrase I use. The future of work is flexible, and it means lots of different things. It means fractional, and it means where we're physically located and when we physically do the work and when we do the work, and all those things I think are a part of that.
Yeah, I would agree. I do think that there's a trust factor, and I do think that work, certain types of work are much better suited if you're doing some sort of team building exercise or giving feedback or brainstorming, training. I think there's a lot to be said, getting to know your colleagues. But you've probably seen this on LinkedIn or articles in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. You've got people who are irate because you force them to come in the office to be on Zoom calls all day. That makes zero sense.
Yeah. If you're going to come to the office and do exactly what you did at home, you shouldn't have come. The reality is, and that's the responsibility of leaders to say the work day needs to be different. The work that we do needs to be different on the days we're in than on the days that we're out. And in fact, if we do that, we can get even more productivity on the days we're out, because those days can be like they were in 2018 or 2019. Remember then, Phil, when someone worked from home and they got all kinds of stuff done because they didn't get interrupted? Well, yeah, and that's not the way it is anymore, right?
No, not at all. Well, in certain companies,
as a general statement,
yeah,
right?
The progressive ones. So whether it was Cisco or Marriott, I detail a couple of case studies in the book about companies. Cisco is one of my favorites from the book. Pre-pandemic in the Manhattan office, Kevin, 70% of the workspace was allocated to individual workstations, basically cubes, desks, offices, whatever. They've inverted it. Now it's 70% for collaborative workspaces, and they've spent a bunch of money. They've even purchased geometrically different conference tables, because if you're at the front, right, of a room and you're dialing in remotely, if it's a square or a rectangle, you got to go like this. Well, that's not really natural. But if you're doing it with a sort of a triangular or polyagonal table, then it's more like this, which is a lot more natural. So I do think that there's a place for the office, but the office is going to look a lot different. I think Marriott also spent a ton of money making the office more like your home with sofas and TVs and a place you'd want to hang out. Some companies have installed bars. So yeah, there are lots of changes taking place, and hopefully the book's examples resonate with folks or make them think. I didn't want this book to be preachy, do this, don't do that. Those books suck.
Well, this is a book that says, "Hey, here's what's going on. You need to make make some decisions." In fact, the end of the book, you gave they say there's 6 things you can do based on what you've heard, and we may get there before we're done. But I want to go to maybe of the 9 things, the one that I would say generally we understand the least, and
Okay.
by we I mean me and the folks who are listening and watching, and maybe even the general population, especially as it relates to work. And that is blockchain. You mentioned it earlier, but talk about what that, don't talk to us about the technology, talk to us about how that's going to impact and how it can impact our business and our work.
Yeah, I think that's essential for us to use a technology that verifies how something got to be. And even though a lot of people conflate blockchain with cryptocurrency, it's understandable. Even though Satoshi Nakamura's white paper in 2008, basically introducing Bitcoin to the world, talks about something like blockchain, he or they or she, no one knows who Nakatomi is. And refers to this notion that we can use a distributed ledger to prove what happened, and it's unalterable, right? So unlike a centralized database that gets hacked all the time, imagine if you kept your money in a bunch of different safe deposit boxes all over the world. So that's a little abstract. Let's make it more real. We're all familiar with document or digital signing tools like DocuSign, and it used to be HelloSign from Dropbox, but they rebranded it as, I think, Dropbox Sign. And they don't all use this technology, but some of them do. If you actually take a look at signing a document, you'll see the metadata, which is a fancy way of saying that Kevin received this document from this IP address on May 5th at 10:06 a.m. Using his Mac computer and da 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 da. Well, that proves that you did something because, again, it's unalterable. So I think that if you think about people doing the work in a remote way using AI tools, and how would you verify that someone actually did something? Or you heard about these stories, I'm sure, during the pandemic, people basically had a second job because they didn't have to go to the office. And there was even one guy I saw, I think it was The Verge, an article. He created an AI tool for Zoom calls that would kind of move his head. So he wasn't really listening. It just looked like he was, or he was just quiet. So it's going to be imperative for us to verify that people have done what they said they do, because we've got these tools that don't just like ChatGPT generate text, but generate Microsoft Copilot, generate software code, or Stability AI or Midjourney to generate images, and some of the audio and video startups that are, quite frankly, a little terrifying. And I was at least pleased to learn that Adobe is working with Microsoft on a creative attribution technology. So
Yep.
you'd mouse over an image or a video, and it would basically tell you how this video or image got born. And if you don't see that, then you can assume that it's not true, because they realize that it's impossible to prove the veracity of something. So flip the equation and say, well, you can't prove that you're true, so we'll assume that you're false. So I I thought that as AI tools like ChatGPT exploded, it became obvious to me that blockchain was going to move from this sort of obscure crypto world into the mainstream a lot faster. And quite frankly, we need it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I was hoping that you would bring up, is that conversation and that connection, because um, we can't talk about these 9 without talking about generative AI. You've said the I guess it's a word, Chat GPT, like 5 times already, and so I heard the other day, and I don't remember who to attribute it to, is that in relationship to this, we're in the first half of the first inning of this game. And I think that that's true, which means there's a lot that none of us can know. And there's also means that there's tremendous amount of opportunity perhaps in front of us. I know that you've said, I wrote this book to give people information and data so they can make their own calls. But I'm curious, as you work with clients and work with leaders at the top, or even leaders in the middle of an organization, what are the things that we ought to be thinking about related to this one? And I'll timestamp it. We're having this conversation on Cinco de Mayo, 2023.
Yeah, I think that it's silly to ignore it, and it's equally silly to embrace it full throttle. There's a reason that companies like Chase and Verizon have effectively banned it. If you're working with a large language model and you're training it, and you're working with sensitive healthcare or financial data, are you in fact training it to replace what you're doing? So I am really intrigued about the ability to remove the 30 to 40% of manual work that we do. And could this free us up to do truly creative things? I think the answer is yes. Could that free us up to maybe do the same amount of work in fewer days? And even so a friend of mine is expecting a second kid. He said, I'd love to work 4 days a week and take a 25% cut in pay. I could be a better father. I could spend more time with my kids and my wife. So there's tremendous potential there, but there's also, I think, a need for human beings who, again, tools like Chat GPT, don't know if it's true. You don't know the source. Even some of the lawsuits that are taking place now. Do you watch the John Oliver show last week tonight?
I did not know.
There was an episode maybe 2 months ago about generative AI tools, and there's a lawsuit now with some of the stock image sites like Getty Images and iStock Photo, because these models scraped data from the web without the permission of the artists or the website. And there was one that John Oliver showed that actually had a blurred watermark from Getty Image on an image that Stability AI or Midjourney, I forget which one,
Quote,
generated. Created, exactly. So there is a legal risk, and there's also an accountability factor. The old axiom, no one ever got fired for hiring IBM, still applies. If I'm paying you to do a job and you didn't do it properly, you and I should have a discussion. But what am I going to do? Yell at Chat GPT? So, I do think, though, that it's sufficiently advanced. And as you said, it's just getting started. As I quote from, I think it's Eric Bjornson. I always screw up his name. A Stanford professor who says that in the future, there'll be two types of lawyers, the ones that use these tools and the ones who used to be lawyers.
Yeah. And I think we could go back and talk about any kind of technology and all of the warning signs, right? Like, listen, if you get on a railroad, if the train goes more than 50 miles an hour, we're going to explode. Well, certainly there were people that said that, right? And we could go all the way through all the things that are going to happen. But one of the things that we've always said about technology is going to make us more productive.
Right.
But the Solo's paradox, which you talk about in the book, says, well, that hasn't necessarily always happened. So I actually want to go there. It's just sort of a small piece of the book, but I think it's so important for us as leaders to think about, like, how do all of these things, and we haven't gone through all 9 and we won't get through all 9. But how does all this relate to productivity in real terms? And what are your thoughts about that?
That's the great unknown, right? Intellectually or intuitively might say, wow, I can Google search something and I don't have to go. I'm old enough to have gone to the library and look at microfiche and card catalogs. And I was just watching All the President's Men a couple of weeks ago, and how they were trying to find a phone number, going through all these papers or calling people at random. Blows my mind that this was 50 years ago, which really historically isn't that long. So you might think, wow, these tools exist, ergo everyone's going to use them and there's going to be massive job loss. I don't see it happening that simply. People have to make the decision to use these tools. We were talking before the podcast about prompts. There are good prompts and bad prompts. And you probably saw the Kevin Roose article from the New York Times in which he had a 2-hour discussion with the new Bing, I think it was. And at the end, Bing or ChatGPT, whatever it was saying, you should leave your wife. So there definitely are downsides to these tools. That's why I encourage people to experiment with them. But I certainly would not be firing all my employees because I'm going to let some sort of generative AI tool do everything for all sorts of reasons. But yes, it can make us more productive. But I also wonder if it'll make us lazy. And the same way a calculator obviates having to calculate your own tip. Well, what if you don't? You can appreciate this being a writer yourself. To me, writing is thinking, it's problem solving, it's dealing with ambiguity. Right. Same thing with coding, you're problem solving. Well, what if there's a tool that just does all that? I'm no longer a college professor, but rather than fight it, I would tell students, look, I can't stop you from using this. But if you're going for a job interview, and I actually heard a story of this happening recently on LinkedIn, and the company or the recruiter's hiring manager quickly determined that this person didn't know anything. He was just using one of these tools and ended the interview very quickly. So it's great to use a calculator, but if you don't have access to one and your bill is $20,
can you do math? Like,
right.
Can you figure out roughly what percentage we're talking about without having a calculator? Right.
Right. So I think there's enormous potential, but it makes sense to be at least a little bit cautious, particularly if you're just going to blindly trust these black boxes. So I read a book a couple of months ago called Like, Comment, and Subscribe about YouTube by Mark Bergen of Bloomberg News. And at one point, the algorithm was spitting out all sorts of nonsense, and they asked engineers to fix it. And they said, we don't know how it comes to this conclusion. So eventually they were able to figure it out. But yeah, there's a real dangerous in putting this blind faith into a tool that just spits out an answer versus if I said, Kevin, why did you do this? You give me your reason. I may not agree with your reason, but at least I understand your rationale.
Exactly. So at the end of the book, you talk about there's 6 choices that we can make. And we've talked briefly about a couple of them. One is to try to ignore it all, right? And we've talked about trying to sort of turn back the clock to pre-pandemic or whatever. Those are a couple of choices. But the choice that you suggest as being the most wise is what you call steering into the skid. So we've had this conversation, and I'm hopefully what it's done is it's told everyone I have a copy of this book so I can be thinking about it. The 9, the tectonic forces that are reshaping the workplace. But at the end, so we're going to give away the end here a little bit. But you say we should steer into the skid. What do you mean, and why do you think that's the wisest choice?
So the analogy that I make in chapter 10 involves newspapers, and many of them for years resisted new technologies. And then finally, when the web broke around the mid 90s and sites like Craigslist decimated their business model, it was basically too late. So you ignore these technologies at your own peril. And you can say, well, we don't believe in employee empowerment, or we don't think inflation affects us because we're in the gas business and the demand for gas is inelastic. Whether it's $2 a gallon or $5 a gallon, people are still going to buy gas. I think that's an incredibly dangerous supposition. And if you look at the history of technology and business, the Blockbusters of the world, right, the Blackberries of the world,
the Kodaks of the world,
right, haven't done well thinking, well, people will always want to go to a photomat and get their pictures developed, or people will always want to go to a video store. So I know that those are kind of cliched analogies, but I just think that it's incredibly dangerous to ignore all these things. Yeah, you may not think that AR and VR are right for you, and I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong, but you need to consider them because, again, these technologies have matured. There are ways, as we've seen with Accenture and Walmart in the book, to train people at a fraction of the cost and reach people who are all over the world without flying them in. So I am a big believer that you need to certainly pay attention to these things. And part of my goal in writing the book was to have these discussions with not only people like yourself, but also on stages for speaking events and with clients to help them figure out the best move. Because again, these things, to your point, Kevin, are moving so quickly that something that may work now in May on Cinco de Mayo of 2023 may not work on Cinco de Ocho in 2024.
Point number 3 for going with the Spanish. Well done.
Gracias.
There you go. Is there anything I didn't ask or that we didn't talk about that you wish we would have?
No, this is a good conversation. I mean, there's so much more we could talk about, whether it's automation or inflation. But yeah, I haven't done too many interviews so far with the book around blockchain, but I think that it's one of those ones that is absolutely essential given all the problems we're having. And yesterday, I think New York Times announced, or 2 days ago, that the basically one of the godfathers of AI quit Google because he's incredibly scared about what's going to happen with this stuff. So not that blockchain will save civilization, but I just think it's irresponsible for business leaders to ignore it. Ditto for all these forces. But no, I really enjoyed the conversation. I like the fact that it wasn't terribly scripted, and I can quote a little Spanish in Niles Bohr.
All in the same 30 minutes, everyone. So by the way, I'm going to be doing a podcast in the metaverse. With the thing on here in the next few weeks. I'm excited about that. So if you're following me on LinkedIn, we'll make sure that you'll get the chance to know about that. You might not be able to join us because you won't have the gear.
I don't have an Oculus.
And I'm expecting to learn a lot, and I'm super excited about that particular thing. So couple of other questions before we go, Phil, sort of shifting gears before we finish. And the first one is, what do you do for fun? I hope you like to write because you're doing it all the time. I hope that's at least somewhat fun, but I want to go beyond that. Like, what do you do for fun?
Yeah, when it's not insanely hot in Gilbert, Arizona, where I live, I enjoy playing tennis. I try to work out, keep myself sane. I'm off to Montreal in a little bit to see a band that I enjoy. So I like concerts, comedy shows, but Yeah, I think if anything, the pandemic underscored for me the need for human connection. I certainly got Zoom fatigue, and I wrote the book on Zoom, so very familiar with that. But yeah, it's good to not look at a screen all day, and movies, TV shows. I right now I'm obsessed with Succession. Do you watch that show?
I have not watched it, but you're like the seventh person
Yeah,
that said I need to. I
they're,
don't
they're
have the
all
right subscription to watch that yet. So
they're all horrible people, but yeah, we're living in this incredible era of prestige TV, and I also hit the gym 5 or 6 times a week. I started doing some of the group classes and the high intensity interval training so I could get my heart rate up to insane levels without hopefully dying. So shaking things up and thinking about different projects on a treadmill is it clears my head quite a bit if I'm stuck on a problem. And I did this way before I started writing books. So as someone who sits on his tuchus all day, I enjoy getting a good sweat in.
and another thing I know that you like to do, and I always ask this question, and I know that you ask it on your podcast as well, is what are you reading these days, Phil?
There is a new book out called Wonder Boy about Tony Hsieh, former CEO of Zappos, who unfortunately died a couple of years ago. And I lived in Las Vegas, where our mutual friend Wayne currently resides. So I met him a few times, and just a fascinating book. I think I started 4 days ago, and I'm about 85% finished with. But yeah, Wonder Boy about Tony Zappos. I forget the subtitle, but yeah, I like to think that if I'm not the world's worst writer, it's because I'm usually reading and reading nonfiction.
Perfect. So last question, where can we learn more about the book, about your work? Where do you want people to connect with you? I'll hold the book up. People are watching. Where can people go? Where do you want them to go?
Yeah, philsimon.com is my website. I am reluctantly on Twitter, but LinkedIn's probably the better place for me.
philsimon.com. We have that. You can get info about this book, the other books there as well. You can find the book wherever fine books are sold, online for sure. The Tectonic Forces, Reshaping the Workplace. We're almost done, Phil. But before I let Phil go and let all of you go, I have a question for all of you. Phil can take a break. Now what? What action are you going to take as a result of this? Now, Phil said this is not a tactical book, and maybe it wasn't a tactical conversation, but there were things here that piqued your interest. There were things here that you need to think about more, learn more about, or even take action on. And so the question is, what are those things? Because if you don't think about the application of what you learned, you won't get nearly as much from this as you would have otherwise. So I hope that you will do that. Phil, thank you so much for having been here. It was such a pleasure. I was looking forward to it. Love the book, and I hope that others will get a copy as well. Thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. I enjoyed it.
Everybody, that's a wrap for this episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. But we'll be back next week. So make sure that you like, subscribe, let other people know, give us stars, wherever you happen to be watching or listening. You know what to do there. Do that and come back and join us next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.